Good afternoon and welcome to the first program in our spring 2018 series at the Overby Center. And just to remind you, we'll have a reception in the lobby following the program. Tonight, we've got a program that just coincidentally dovetails with Black History Month. We'll consider the campaign to integrate churches in Jackson in the 1960s. Dalton Lyon has written a book on the subject, Sanctuaries of Segregation, which grew out of his doctoral dissertation while a history student here at Ole Miss. I think he completed it in 2010. I was one of the members of the faculty who kind of met with Dalton from time to time. I see Ted Allenby there, who was also involved in the project. And it was a very impressive piece of work here, and the book is a very impressive piece of work. So Dalton's gone on to become chairman of the history department at St. Mary's Episcopal School in Memphis. But Dalton, we're glad to have you back at Ole Miss tonight. Since the Methodist churches became a special target of this campaign, we asked Warren Black to come out of the audience where he frequently is for our programs and be a participant on our panel tonight. Warren is a retired pastor of the Oxford University United Methodist Church, and 18 years he was here, which is really rare for a Methodist minister. And he may be retired, but he's still a community leader in Oxford, and I know that Warren would not have approved of some of the things that went on with the Methodist Church back in those days. Moderating the program tonight will be Charles Overby, chairman of our center here. Charles is always skilled as a moderator, but tonight he brings a special perspective because as a young man growing up in Jackson, he witnesses attempts to integrate his own church in Jackson, and I think they were a transformative experience for him. So I look forward to the program. Gentlemen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Curtis. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you tonight and for this to be our very first program of 2018. Before we turn to Dalton, who's written this fine book, I want to try to take us back in time and set the stage. Some of you who may be almost as old as I am can remember those shameful days when white churches turned away African Americans simply because they were African Americans. And so as part of setting that stage, I'll offer my comment, and I want to turn to Warren, who's much younger than me, but I went to Calvary Baptist Church, which was on Capitol Street in Jackson, and I watched African Americans attempt to go to Sunday morning worship service, and the police arrested them. And back then there was something called Thompson's Tank. A few of you might remember that. It was a paddy wagon, but it was also like a tank. It was prepared for battle. And so Thompson's Tank had pulled up. The Calvary Baptist Church sat back from the street. It was a pretty impressive structure and lots of steps going into the front door. So Thompson's Tank was right there at the bottom of the steps. And they threw those African Americans who simply wanted to worship at Calvary Baptist Church, threw them in the back of the paddy wagon. And my memory is that they did throw them. Maybe they didn't, but that's my memory. And it shocked my sensitivities in a way that I didn't really have any sensitivities back then. I had a fairly sheltered life, and I didn't think much about race. But at that time, I said, this is wrong. And this is recounted some in Dalton's book, as are a number of other experiences. Now, Warren's younger than me. He looks a lot younger than me, but he's a little bit younger than me. But he is the product of Methodist ministers. And I'll let him tell the story, but he was in small towns, and he lived firsthand what it was like to have a father preacher who had moderate views on race. So bring us up to date on how that worked for you growing up, Warren.
Okay, thank you. Probably one of the first memories I had was when Dad was serving in the Ripley community, and Ripley, he had small churches, and he received a call one day from an African American lady, and I was just under 10 at the time, but he gave her a courtesy title and referred to her as Mrs. So-and-so. And I remember my mother being quite concerned and really kind of lighting into my father for, you don't address African Americans with titles. And Mother was a good person. She's just a product of her age. And Dad had been to Emory and done his thesis there on Bethlehem centers, which was community centers that the Methodist Church had in larger venues. And in his first parish in Kemper County at Porterville, he was very young, rode a bicycle around. Occasionally he would ride down to the black school. But his superintendent let him know pretty quick in the Methodist Church that, quote, I remember Dad telling me this, his name was Dennis. You just didn't do that in Mississippi in the 30s. That was his interest. But so I remember the Ripley event, and then later on at another church in Lowndes County, small community. And this was the year of the Ole Miss crisis, 1962, and I was 12 at the time. But you know, Dad did the best he could. But one of the reasons we only stayed there 1 year, and one of the reasons was that on the way to the post office or the bank, that my father would speak to African Americans on the street. He didn't say anything a lot in the pulpit other than just moderation and nonviolence, but that was something you didn't do. People were so paranoid at that time. And of course, all the events happening here. So, Charles, I'm sorry, that was just a couple of things that got me involved.
How did that affect you growing up?
Well, you know, very vulnerably. I mean, you feel like, you know, you're moving to these small towns and all this is going on, and you want to be accepted and part of the group. But, you know, I thought about the ministry at that stage, but to use the vernacular, not no, but hell no. So, yeah, I didn't want any part of it. I didn't want to, for my family to have to go through that. So ultimately, after I graduated from Millsaps, I, you know, had flirted with the ministry. They even had some churches one summer, but, you know, I decided to go to law school, and just to provide, you know, the church was so vulnerable, and I said, you know, I've got to have something I can fall back on.
Yep, that's good. So Dalton, there's so much rich history relating to civil rights in Mississippi in the 60s, and particularly the early 60s. But this is an area that really hasn't been covered much. Why did you write this book, and how did you come to tackle this subject?
It's a good question. And I was, and I guess this event of these church visits, this kneel-in campaign, gets mentioned just briefly in several books. And I think it was in graduate school, my first year, where I read a book that mentioned this event, and it piqued my interest. Both, you know, I came to this school and wanted to get a PhD in history and wanted to study civil rights, and I was interested in the religious dynamics of it, how white churches responded to it, but this phenomenon, these spectacles of being turned away, that just wasn't really on my radar. I didn't even know that that tactic really even existed. So when I was looking for something to write for a master's thesis, I I did a little digging to see how widespread this phenomenon was, and learned actually at that time that there was a religious professor at Rhodes who was doing a similar work on what happened in Memphis, but that nobody had really dug deep into this event. And so it's one of those kind of happy accidents that I was able to do something that hadn't really been analyzed in depth before. And when I did some digging that summer, this would have been my first summer after my first year in the master's program, I really just started by looking at newspaper articles and just reading the Clarion Ledger for a year. And I realized very quickly, just looking at the outlines of this event, that there was a lot more to it, that parts of this story had been told, like what happened at Galloway Methodist, and to some extent at First Baptist, but the extent to which this involved many other churches of many other denominations, and the totality of this campaign hadn't really been analyzed. And so I was just sort of fortunate that nobody had looked at it yet.
Let's start with how the kneel-ins began. And you have to say, as I read your book, it started with Tougaloo College and Reverend Ed King. You want to talk about that?
That's right. So this idea of going to white churches and confronting that segregated space, this is something that some activists had done in other parts of the South. It just hadn't happened in Jackson yet. In fact, when SNCC was founded in 1960, as part of their charter, they talk about the usefulness of this campaign, that this, more than anything, might convince white Christians about and convince them of the immorality of segregation. So it had been done in other places, but it hadn't been done in Jackson. And this is something that they had talked about doing when the Jackson movement, as it's called, really got going in the spring of 1963. This is, as Ed King tells it, something that he and Medgar Evers wanted to do. It was just a matter of when to do it and sort of the timing of it. And that spring of 63 is also when the Birmingham campaign is well underway, and there were church visits, there were kneel-ins at Birmingham churches. In fact, going on at the same time that Dr. King is in jail writing a letter from a Birmingham jail. So they had this idea that it was just a matter of when to do it, and so the way that it worked out was they had presented city leaders, the mayor and the Chamber of Commerce, with some demands about integrating businesses and how we're going to treat customers. And when those demands were not met, that's when they commenced direct action in Jackson. And so the famous Woolworth sit-in, that's when that happened. And so there were pickets and marches and protests and sit-ins, but no church visits yet. They wanted to see how that worked itself out, and the way that phase of the Jackson movement essentially worked itself out was that they got an injunction prohibiting any future actions. And in fact, this injunction even listed Medgar Evers and Ed King on the injunction. And that really fractured the movement at that point. There were those who wanted to press ahead, like Ed King and Medgar Evers and this Tougaloo group. And there were others, especially in the NAACP, who did not. And so those wanting to press ahead, the idea was, well, we're going to get arrested, whatever we do. Why don't we try kneel-ins? And so that is what they did. And to their surprise, no one was arrested, even though according to the injunction, there were police present. And according to the injunction, it was within their capability, at least what police people were ordered to do. They weren't arrested. And so that, for these activists, really opened up this idea that this could be a space. This space in front of churches and potentially inside churches could be a place of dialogue. And that's really, I think, the important sort of one of the important lessons I learned out of this that really separates this kind of tactic from a sit-in or a march, that really dialogue was the objective. And if we can convince white Christians and tap into the silent moderates who they felt were out there, if we can tap into that sentiment, then we can help steer the state towards moderating their position.
As I read your book, the thesis was that it was immoral and unchristian to not allow blacks to attend white churches, and that by appealing to the Christian nature of it, that would break down the racial barriers. But as we saw through the resistance in Jackson, the Christians were able to compartmentalize their Christianity. They were segregationists and they were Christians. So ultimately, about 40 people were arrested in that 2-year period. Some denominations fared a little better in that than others. So you talked about Catholics, Episcopalians, Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterians. Who did well and who did poorly, relatively speaking?
Well, they for the first several weekends of this campaign, this began in June of '63, and actually when Medgar Evers drove students to First Baptist in Jackson, that was one of the last things that he did on this earth. He was murdered 2 days later in his driveway. And so they cast a wide net that first weekend, and also went to Lutheran.
I forgot
churches
Lutheran,
and
sorry.
the
Lutheran.
Unitarian, yeah, just to be
Unitarian
completely
denomination.
ecumenical. They really did target everyone. All the downtown churches got targeted, and so once they realized, so from the beginning, the first church to admit was the second Sunday, which was St. Andrew's Episcopal, and that's actually the cover, the picture. There are very few pictures taken of these church visits, but this was taken by an AP photographer and was in the New York Times and in the LA Times, was in some national papers, but fittingly not in any local papers, because what they were trying to demonstrate was that this was an open church, and that was a big deal when St. Andrews admitted 4 black students and continued to admit. And so the Episcopal churches were open, and it's for a number of reasons. It's like the Catholic Church, there's a lot of hierarchical decision making, and the bishops in both had made it clear that was going to be the policy. But as I found out through the research, it really doesn't matter what the minister says or believes. It matters who is outside those church doors. In fact, there was one Sunday, it didn't make it into the book because I learned about it after the fact, but there was a Sunday where students were actually turned away from St. Andrews because there were a group of men outside of that church barring their entry. So other than that, the Episcopal churches and the Catholic parishes were open. The Methodist churches were closed. The Baptist churches were closed and remain closed. The Lutheran churches
Closed to African Americans.
closed to African Americans, sorry, where they barred black visitors. The big flagship Lutheran church, I go into that story because it's an example, and the same thing at First Christian, a Disciples of Christ church. These were 2 churches that had ministers who wanted open doors, and they had been at their churches for a decade at this point, and they had done, in their minds, great work to try to steer their congregation to a position of openness, but they did not have lay leaders, a majority of lay leaders supporting them. And so in both those instances, those were churches that were closed, even though it was against the pastor's beliefs and convictions.
Why did you choose to focus primarily on Methodist?
It's a good question. So this campaign, as I said, at the beginning they did cast a wide net. And they targeted all different denominational flavors. But pretty soon, that summer of '63, and as we entered into the fall, they were meeting the most resistance in Methodist churches. And there was something you could say personal at stake. Ed King was an ordained Methodist minister. And in his mind, you could argue, as some of his detractors said, that it was personal. He was doing this to try to embarrass the Methodist Church. But strategically, the Methodist denomination at the time was rigidly segregated. There were, not only black and white churches, but a whole jurisdictions within the denomination. When the Methodist Church unified in the 30s, 39, that was part of the unification, was that Jim Crow would exist within the Methodist denomination. And so Ed King and others from outside of Mississippi, other Methodist ministers, were just horrified that this was happening, because the Methodist beliefs and recent decrees from the Methodist convention, the most recent Methodist convention, seemed to be pretty clear about what the policies of churches should be. So once a group was arrested at Capitol Street Methodist Church, this was in September of '63, just weeks after the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, and right after the Citizens Council, the Jackson Citizens Council, had announced that they had a plan to save these churches from integration, and that's the wording that they used. Suddenly, police made some arrests on Worldwide Communion Sunday at Capitol Street Methodist, and that is that was big news across the country. That Methodists that folks not even being turned away, but arrested, and so that's really the moment that the campaign, they continued to go to churches that were open. That was an important point, as sort of a counterexample to the closed churches. But yes, they really did pivot towards targeting Methodist churches. Out-of-state ministers came to join with Tougaloo students, and what they called this witness. That's the word that they used. But it was really that, I think, because it suddenly had a national kind of focus beyond just integrating churches. It got that attention nationally.
So the National Methodist hierarchy had policies that said all Methodist churches would be open to all races. Yet,
Said that in the discipline, is that what the...
Yes.
Yeah.
yet they didn't have any teeth in that.
They did not.
Talk about that.
Yeah, they did not have any teeth, and this exposes that flaw. And so I guess there are a couple of levels where kind of the enforcement broke down. And one clear level had to do with the leadership in the Mississippi Conference, and with the bishop and the district superintendent, who in substance wouldn't back up the ministers, like at Galloway, who favored open doors. And the doors are not going to open until a new bishop actually comes in, Bishop Pendergrass,
Right.
Who slowly, but by 1966, begins to change. So yes, the enforcement broke down. They did try, another way that it broke down, they did try to essentially take it before the church council, before the Methodist denomination trial court. And what they decreed was that it wasn't clear enough. The 1960 discipline wasn't clear enough. And so they made it more clear, closed the loophole, and it stopped being an issue.
Mm-hmm. But bishops from outside of Mississippi came and tried to go in with some of the African American students, and even bishops were turned away, right?
That's right. The bishop for the central jurisdiction, his name was Charles Golden. That was the all-black jurisdiction within the Methodist Church. And Bishop James Matthews, who was from Boston, came down. And the two of them tried to attend Galloway on Easter Sunday. And from what I could tell, fully expected to get in. How could you turn away two Methodist bishops? one black was one white, and one was white, and they were turned away. And that was really the last major visit. At this point, the Tougaloo activists are turning attention to what we now call Freedom Summer, the Mississippi Summer Project of '64. And there's a sense that, we gave you a chance. And if you're going to turn away two Methodist bishops, then, we tried. But that's, if you're going to turn away bishops, then we've failed, evidently.
According to your book, police frequently arrested the kneel-in activists without the churches asking them to. You want to talk about that and perhaps what role the Citizens Council and the Sovereignty Commission played in all this?
That is, yes. So this is one interesting facet of this campaign was the resistance to it and the coordinated resistance within different levels of government. As I said, they were very surprised at the beginning that police didn't arrest them. And really for, until October, from June to October of '63, there were no arrests. And then suddenly the police began arresting. And I go into a little bit, it's of the theories behind why that started happening. But clearly there were the Citizens Council's announcement to save these churches from integration and determined lay leaders within these congregations who realized that this wasn't going to stop anytime soon, and we've got to stop this. And with some friendly city leaders, Mayor Allen Thompson was the mayor at the time, and he was a prominent member of Galloway, and he had a hand, evidently, in this decision as well to begin arresting. So it was without really the choice of the minister in these cases. These were lay leaders, city police, and the mayor really behind this. And they were arrested for trespassing was a charge. Most of the arrests occurred either on the church steps or on the sidewalk out in front of the church. They didn't go inside. Or another charge was, and a lot of times in conjunction with trespassing, was disturbing divine worship was the other charge. And both were $500 bails that were set. And, as opposed to, and one other distinguishing facet of what happened in Jackson was that these were not, when you hear the term kneel-in, you get you may picture that folks were actually kneeling down and refused to move as you would have in a sit-in, for instance. And that's not at all what happened here. They would arrive in their Sunday dress with their gloves and their Bible and try to engage ushers in conversation if they told them they could not enter. But once it was clear that they couldn't enter, they would leave the premises. They did not fall down on their knees. So yes, they were arrested for trespassing, disturbing divine worship, even though in all the cases they actually tried to leave the premises.
One of the big pushbacks from the white lay people were the motives of the African Americans who wanted to come in and the outsiders. Can you talk about that exchange, about how and why they questioned the motives, and then the pushback on that?
One thing that I wanted to try to get a sense of was why they were turning these students away, and in particular, what were they saying to these students? Were they articulating some sort of theological defense of segregation? Was that the conversation that ushers were communicating? And the answer is no, that's not at all what they were talking about. They would, especially the Methodist ministers who came down, of course, the outsider, y'all are outsiders. Even though these are Methodist ministers trying to go to a Methodist church, you're an outsider. These students, a lot of them had been arrested before and already had sort of been publicly outed as activists. And so it was easy for them to just be designated, you know, you are doing this for political purposes. You're trying to score a political point. You are not here to sincerely worship God. If you were sincere, you would go to that other church down the road. You have your own church to go to. That was the kind of thing that was communicated. And the other common refrain was that these are private houses of God. These aren't public spaces. These are private houses of God. This campaign is happening as the Civil Rights Bill is working its way through Congress, so this was part of that discourse. But Mississippi had passed a law called the Church Property Bill in 1960, which gave congregations the ability to secede from their parent or regional denomination and take their properties with them. And so that, I think, also explains at least that excuse. So yes, there were a number of things that they were told, and you know, and as we talked before, the sincerity part of it is the one that's, you know, especially, they're all dubious, of course, but the one that's especially, you can't really hold up to much logic. As the pastor at St. Andrews, his name was Chris Keller, and there was a vestry meeting where some of his vestry members were saying, well, they're not sincere. And his answer was, are all of you sincere in wanting to come every Sunday morning? If I gauge the sincerity of every person who entered the church, you know, there'd be 10 people in there on any given Sunday.
Dalton, talk about the role of the two Jackson newspapers in all of this.
You know, anybody who wants to get a sense of any time period, of course, and for me, you just reading the newspapers, you really get a sense of the not only the daily actions, but in particular how the media wants to frame something to the population, how they want to communicate a certain ideology. And in this case, you really get a sense. Jackson had two newspapers, a daily, the morning paper and the evening paper, both owned by the same family who were prominent members of First Baptist, the Heddermans. Am I pronouncing that right? The Heddermans. And they were working very hard to sustain a narrative of the city of Jackson that this was a city that was committed to segregation. And you see this in a daily way. And so it was interesting how these events were portrayed. They were never portrayed on the front page. It's always buried, so I had to kind of search. And if I knew these visits were on a Sunday, I was looking at Monday and Tuesday papers, sometimes Wednesday papers. These were buried, but the stories were once you found it, were very clear of all the students who were involved, their hometowns in Mississippi. And it would a lot of times also be accompanied by some kind of essay, some kind of editorial proclaiming the morality of segregation and the idea that segregation was the will of God. So you have these news stories, and in either in the editorial section or sometimes on the front page, a essay, defending that kind of point of view. So it was certainly an interesting lesson in how the people of Jackson, the citizens of Jackson, were receiving their news. Those on the outside, New York Times, Chicago paper, the LA Times, were largely AP articles. There was an AP writer who had a different take on events.
Right. Well, I'm going to the audience here in a minute for questions, but first I want to ask Warren to comment on how things changed. And there was this great quote from Dalton. He said, churches were not mere captives to white supremacist culture. Churches provided clear institutional support for white supremacy. So Warren, my question to you, as you entered the ministry and moved forward, clearly your churches were not institutional supporters of white supremacy. How did it change? And how did this all play out for you as a pastor some years later after white supremacy was beginning to crumble?
Well, growing up, the churches in Mississippi in the South, Methodist churches, primarily ignored the national church dictates, and a lot of that depended on your leadership, as we said. And dear old Bishop Franklin, who was my boyhood bishop, he retired in '64, but my father served under him. He was greatly beloved in the white community, but again, no leadership. And then the superintendent of the Jackson district, who called Ed King, if I'm right, I've got the quote, I wrote it down just a second.
Unstable?
Yeah,
something
an emotionally unstable rabble-rouser. So, and Ed King, what you have to remember, Ed King was not ordained by the Mississippi Conference. In fact, they rejected his ordination. The same time the Woolworths sit-ins were going on, the Methodist Conference was meeting at Galloway 2 blocks away, and some of these students were getting beat up. Well, the church was oblivious to that. And there really, really is something you're aware of in civil religion. And in the South, that's just part of it. Not only the South, but you realize, no, you don't question the motives of people who come to church. But in the South, it's the thing to do, and it reflects the social mores of the time. By the time I came into the church, race was not really an issue. I mean, anyone could come, but 11 o'clock is still the most segregated hour in America, the churches. So go back to your question, Charles.
Yeah, I was wondering how it changed, and I know your church in Oxford early on.
Yeah, early
policies.
60s, Oxford University Church opened their doors, and that was not without some cost. They lost some members, but they did the right thing. And some of professors here at Ole Miss, Gerald Walton for one, was responsible for help that happen. So, I never really, in my ministry of 35 years or so, really had to face the racial issue. Other issues have replaced that, orientation and ordination of gays.
You were quoted, Warren, in one article I read that it's more subtle now. And you've been involved in organizations trying to help with racial harmony. Talk about the blatancy of the early 60s and what you perhaps call more subtle attitudes of today.
Well, I think a lot of it has, and it always been this way, it's not only racial, but it's become economic. I mean, middle class African Americans and upper middle class African Americans are accepted, anywhere. I'm not sure our churches are open as far as economic, there's an economic divide. And not that poor people can't come, they just are not as made to feel as welcome. I mean, we just have to acknowledge that.
And that's white or black, right?
That's white or black. And I do think economics in one way has replaced race, not totally. I think we're in a situation in America now where there's a throwback. I think the racial divide has gotten larger. So I'm not sure where it's going. And also the economic divide. Economic inequality is at a greater divide now, I think, than any other time in our history.
I want to go to the audience. I've got plenty of other questions, but I want you to be able to ask questions of these two good panelists. I know some of you were in Jackson, belonging to churches who are even mentioned in this book. Any questions? Yes, Bob.
Yeah, my name is Bob Williams. I'm from Jackson, and I'm old enough, as you can tell, to have remembered some of those days. The one thing I remember most was the episode involving Dr. Segal at Galloway. But my memory is
So he's another one of these Jackson ministers who had been around, in his case, for decades, and had built up a lot of goodwill in his church. And in 1961, when the Freedom Riders were coming through Jackson, the police did a good job of alerting all the downtown ministers that these activists might try to show up at your church, and so you need to be ready for that. So that is when the official board of Galloway, 1961, voted to close their doors. And there was another church who also did that, First Christian in 1961. And so he made his views clear at the time that if, in fact, even though that's the policy, if in fact any African Americans are turned away, I'm resigning right at that moment. So that was 1961. Soon after that, he got an assistant there. Jerry Furr was his name, Reverend Furr, who was one of the signers of what's called the Born of Conviction Statement, which came out in early 1963 after the Meredith crisis, and really after a lot of ministers throughout the state were feeling that their freedom of speech at the pulpit was being restricted. They had denounced the violence. And so he had a minister, an associate that was already kind of publicly marked as someone who was not a segregationist. So again, he had promised, and in fact, as he said, he would carry in his pocket every Sunday his resignation statement so that he could deliver it when it in fact occurred. So this first Sunday in June of '63, students were turned away. And as Ed King tells it, he didn't think they'd get turned away from Galloway because of Sela's stand. Even though the church, the official board, had a closed-door policy, he still felt that they could attend. So they had actually been turned away from First Baptist and walked around the block to Galloway and were turned away there. Dr. Sela hears about it before the church, or during, I think, the first choral anthem, and instead of giving the sermon, he reads the statement resigning, and his associate resigns at that moment as well. So he fits in right at the beginning of this, and that's really set Galloway into some tumultuous years right there. And really the city of Jackson, he's one of these moderating voices that left. He went to Missouri after this, and really his congregation deprived the city of Jackson of a great voice.
Dalton, one of the interesting things I think, as you point out so well in your book, is on that Easter Sunday when Bishop Matthews from Boston and Bishop Golden, the African-American bishop, came and were turned away. On that very Sunday, Birmingham, that great bastion of liberality, was holding in Legion Field a Billy Graham crusade, and African Americans and whites were there. Of course, what had preceded that, is you point out, is the bombing this church in Birmingham. These 4 little girls were murdered. But I thought that was interesting. In Jackson, you're turning bishops away on Easter Sunday. In Birmingham, you're celebrating at least a Billy Graham crusade in which the races are coming together.
Other questions? Andy?
I remember the freshman bill set in '66, about Noose Bomb, home was bombed, as well as the Jewish synagogue there by the Klansman Tommy Terrence. What role did Rabbi Nussbaum play in this?
Yes, he was one thing that I came across and was happy to share, that was a revelation, at least to me and to many in Jackson, was that really behind the scenes, and not so much in secret, but very much behind the scenes, there were these ministers and clergy, and including Rabbi Nussbaum, who had been meeting for years before this crisis. And so he was a part of this network of clergy that would have included Dr. Sela, and Fondren's pastor, Moody McDill at the time, and Reverend Houland at First Christian. So he was part of this network. But as he said, I got some of his documentation from an archives in Cincinnati. He was very clear to them, this is your all's problem. This is white Christianity's problem. And so in 1963, when students were turned away that first Sunday, he made a point of going before his lay leaders at the synagogue. What are we going to do? And they actually voted to have an open door policy. And he felt that some members were so offended that they even had to do that. Like, wasn't it obvious that we would welcome? So he comes up some in this book in that respect, is that he was part of this community of like-minded clergy who, by 1966, 67, there aren't many left. In fact, he's probably the only one at the time of the bombing.
Who else?
Yes.
As you were doing this research in mid to late 2000s,
Yes.
were there any churches in the Jackson area that were hostile to your efforts? Look at the documents of any churches who have not threatened reaction.
Thank you, Robert. That's a good question. Early in this research, I mailed out letters to all these churches and directed to the pastors and wondering, could I come look at whatever documentary evidence you have, any archives that you're willing to let me look at, or would you be willing to put me in contact with someone who was around at the time who would be willing to talk about it? And so that's how I got a lot of good kind of insider information, a lot of these churches. But yes, there were some who were not interested in meeting, and maybe some for legitimate reasons. There was one church, a Baptist church, that after several emails ultimately expressed to me that this never happened, that no one was ever turned away from that particular church. And there was another church that I should mention that refused to help me out. Their reasoning had to do with that I wasn't a member of the church, of that particular church. But I've since learned, and I'm talking about First Presbyterian, I've since learned that they have come a long way since I've done my original research. In fact, just in the last year, have had some congregation-wide meetings and votes reckoning with their past. So yes, I think it would be interesting if I had done this research now, as opposed to mostly in 2005 to 2010. There were maybe some different stories to tell that I could have told. But that was really, and maybe it wasn't a surprising thing, but it was just really kind of disheartening. I can understand why you wouldn't want to air that dirty laundry, but if you believe in reconciliation as in terms of theology, then you have to reconcile even the things you don't want people to know about necessarily.
Talking about reckoning with our past, tell us about the recent events in December that focused on this and really provided, I think, an uplifting outlook.
Absolutely. Some of the downtown churches in Jackson wanted to, and it just happened to coincide with the release of my book last year, wanted to have a series of panels and an ecumenical service. And the timing, not only the bicentennial of the state, but also they want to do this amidst the Civil Rights Museum that was opening in Jackson. And so the weekend before the opening of the museum, there were a number of events, and one very powerful event at Tougaloo, at the chapel there, beautiful chapel, where there were some of the former students, in fact, one woman who is in this picture, and Ed King was there, and another student who was arrested. And it was just very moving for at least for me to hear, and for these people to hear not only their experience but how they remember it, how important it was to them. So the ones who were really behind that effort were Galloway and St. Andrews were the ones who really put that together, and Galloway in particular has come a long way. There's an associate there, Emily, who I've gotten to know, who's been there a while, and just some good people there who want to recognize what has happened. One of the bishops who was turned away on that Easter Sunday has come back twice. Bishop Matthews has come back. So yes, there is a reckoning. There needs to continue to be that. I think there needs to be more openness, even up on web pages, that this is part of our history, that we need to own it. And yes, to the extent that this book serves as some truth telling, I'm happy to sell books, but I'm glad that there is some that we've been able to document this so that you can't deny it.
It's hard to admit that you were wrong. When I was editor of the Clarion Ledger, years after all of these problems, I thought it was important to write an editorial, and the lead on the editorial was, "We were wrong, wrong, wrong." It's easy for me to say I wasn't there, but as an institution, the Clarion Ledger needed to acknowledge that it was wrong. And so the churches probably have the same obligation to admit their complicity in this. The title of the book is Sanctuaries of Segregation. I think a fair-minded assessment, and Warren made a reference to it, is that most churches are still sanctuaries of segregation. Does that mean that the effort failed? Does that mean that we haven't come very far? Or is it just the way it's always going to be?
That's a very good question. I'd appreciate your input as well. For me, there are a lot of reasons why this is still the most segregated hour, and I think you could say the original sin was in slavery, and in particularly after the Civil War, when there was a concerted effort to help to help African Americans set up their own churches, but also to get them out of these white churches. But then there's this, and I think one thing that was interesting as I did a lot of the research is that this really surprises people of my generation, people who were born after this, that they can't believe that this happened. So it's almost that there's this institutional, there's something institutional about this, that it's not just about knowing that this happened. So has it been a failure? I would say, I think the only way to make this work, to make the kingdom of God, to make churches look like it's going to look in heaven, is to be intentional about it. Because I go to the same type of church that my parents and my wife's parents, and these are generational things that you have to, I think, create spaces that are intentionally interracial and interclass, and breaking that cycle. I think, other than doing something just very intentional.
Yeah, and I think St. Peter's Episcopal here has done that over the years with Duncan Gray and his leadership with Second Baptist. And Oxford University for a number of years has been working with Burns United Methodist, now First Methodist, on particular Sundays to go and worship. But will it change? I don't know. I think there has to be an acknowledgement of the sin, and we've had bishops who've led our conference in services of forgiveness and reconciliation. You have to start there, and then I'll highlight, Dalton, what you said. I think efforts have to be intentional. I think it just does not happen, but I think where the social milieu is broken down, or having joint tailgatings in the Grove, and just times, informal times for people to come together socially, and then that spills over into the church. You know, I don't think the church is too often the church has been the tail lights instead of the headlights. I'd like to see that change.
Well, I'd like to end on an optimistic note. Beyond the racial, I know the Baptist churches I belong to, pretty suspect of any Methodists that come in regardless of their race. And second, we probably could say that in the 60s they were sanctuaries of forced segregation, and hopefully we go long past when anybody would be turned away from a church.
Absolutely.
Because of their race.
Charles, I've heard it said that there will be Baptists long after they're Christians.
Well, I can't end on that note. So, on an optimistic note, I want to quote from the book. Catholic Bishop Richard Garrow of Jackson was an early proponent of allowing blacks to attend Catholic churches. He wrote, "Remember, the parish is a general church and may be attended by anyone, no matter what his race. The duty of the pastor is to make our people realize there is only one race recognized by Almighty God, and that is the human race." So I want to thank all of you for coming, and thank especially our terrific panelists. Appreciate your being here today.